So good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. Welcome to our second community engagement session called the Who, What, When, Where, and Why of Ending Homelessness. To begin with, we'd like to acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 7 and neighbor to Treaty 4 territory traditional lands of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Stoney Nakoda, and Tsinitsa, as well as the Cree, Sioux, and the Saulteaux bands of the Ojibwa peoples. We also honor and acknowledge that we are situated on the homelands of the Métis Nation within Region 3. So the who of ending homelessness. This presentation and our conversation today will give you a high-level overview of a little bit of the historical information around ending homelessness and how it came to be not in just Medicine Hat, but at a provincial and federal level as well. So a really great place to start when we talk about ending homelessness is actually at the federal level, so the Government of Canada. So the Government of Canada has always recognized that homelessness in Canada is unacceptable, especially given that we are a fairly wealthy country. It does not make sense for the degree and how many people live in our country that people are living in extreme poverty and experiencing homelessness. To combat that, the Government of Canada launched the National Homelessness Initiative, or NHI, in 1999. They invested $753 million over a 3-year time span, and then later reinvested $405 million for the next 3 years of this. The approach was similar to the one that we actually see operating today throughout the country. It's a decentralized approach, meaning that there's local autonomy given to local jurisdictions throughout Canada. And it comes in the form as a community entity, or CE. And there's 2 funding streams now. There never was historically around Indigenous homelessness, or Aboriginal homelessness as it was called at the time, as well as designated community funding. So the key focus of the National Homelessness Initiative were 3 at the time: facilitate community capacity by coordination of government efforts in enhancing the diversity of tools and resources throughout each one of those communities. The second one was to foster effective partnerships and investments that address the needs of those still experiencing homelessness. And the third one is increase awareness and understanding of homelessness. This was at a time when there was not a lot of movements around homelessness and not a lot of information or training about those experiencing homelessness. The change in government in 2006 came with a desire to revitalize the National Homeless Initiative. And at that time, it was renamed the Homelessness Partnering Strategy. It adapted and modified most of the program areas of the NHI and continued the philosophy and approach to support community-based solutions, empowering communities to determine their own needs and develop projects based on what the community was actually needing to achieve and look for in terms of addressing homelessness. This ranged from things such as supportive housing and transitional housing as well. This was the year that we saw the ability to actually invest in capital projects in communities throughout Canada. It also was the first time that we saw housing first language in any government strategy at the federal level, and the recognition that housing first was a viable and a great evidence-based option to look at homelessness. The HPS was in place until 2019. So, which means the HPS strategy was from 2006 up until 2019. On April 1st, 2019, the federal Reaching Home Canada's Homelessness Strategy initiative replaced the HPS strategy and expanded the support given to communities to end homelessness. Reaching Home was designed to support the National Housing Strategy, the very first of its kind throughout Canada. And this alignment and coordination had a significant impact on the way that all jurisdictions throughout Canada operate. Things like ensuring and requiring that a coordinated access system are in place and that we reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. One of the key focus areas, again, was that reducing chronic homelessness by 50% by 2028. Now, for those communities that were fortunate enough to get federal and maybe provincial funding in years prior, this was something that was a little bit more achievable and attainable. For those communities that are just starting out, or maybe back in 2019 just starting out, this is a huge task. Keep in mind, in Medicine Hat, we have 12 plus years of trial and error of creating good systems and planning to go behind us, but we too need to adhere to that 50% reduction in chronic homelessness based on our own baseline. With this strategy, with the HPS strategy, there was significant money, but the Reaching Home Canada's current strategy invested a significant amount of money into actually ending homelessness. And the beautiful part of this one was that was actually tied to a national housing strategy, which is a place to call home. This was, again, as I said, the first strategy throughout Canada. We actually had a national housing strategy. So in a country as fortunate as Canada, not to have a actual housing strategy was quite interesting until 2019. So this strategy invested 40 plus billion over 10 years. Key focus areas are to cut chronic homelessness in half. If you notice the alignment with the above Reaching Home strategy, there is direct alignment. Remove 530,000 families from from poor housing need. Invest in construction of up to 100,000 new housing units, and repair or renew 300,000 housing units. That includes social housing units as well. So that's a little bit about the federal government role in addressing homelessness. We can't look at homelessness in the absence of looking at the housing strategies as well. Something that maybe folks don't know is that historically, and when we look at the trends of homelessness throughout Canada, so Medicine Hat would align with this as well, when the federal government started to divest funds into sustainable housing options, including affordable housing and social housing options, we actually saw significant increases in homelessness. So we can directly correlate the number of people experiencing homelessness directly to policy, if you will. When there was a decrease in the amount of federal funding, there was a substantial increase in homelessness. And that is why the National Housing Strategy is so paramount, because this is the biggest investment in housing that we've seen across Canada in a very long time. So when we go to the provincial role in ending homelessness, in 2000 or in 1999-2000, the federal investment that we just learned about brought together Alberta's 7 major cities. We call them the 7 cities. There is a website, it's called 7 Cities on Housing and Homelessness. That is a wealth of information. It goes through each of those community strategies as well. And they are listed on your screen there for you. Part of the interesting time, I'm going to slide from provincial and federal government knowledge here. So back in 1999-2000, the Canadian and Alberta government both announced funding for homeless initiatives. The funding portfolios were created in direct response to a growing national issue of homelessness. And interesting enough, it was among the working poor. So it was around people losing their housing, not those that were chronically homeless living on the street at that time. So in early 1999, the Medicine Hat Community Housing Society was incorporated into the Societies Act by the Board of Directors and the Medicine Hat Regional Social Housing Agency, or MRSHA is what it was called. So given the number of individuals and families at the time, there was an excess of 200 on our social housing wait list. The Medicine Hat Community Housing Society was created to fundraise for the development of new social housing. By 2000, the Government of Canada had actually identified 61 communities across the country that had significant problems with homelessness. In Alberta, the 7 Cities on Housing and Homelessness received this designation, Medicine Hat being one of those communities. So I can't envision where this community would be without that designation. So at that time in Medicine Hat, the mayor of Medicine Hat at the time, Honorable Garth Valley, directed staff to gather a group of people, form a society, and carry out the necessary work to assess the funding and access all the funding available at the time through provincial and federal funds. The MRSHA board at the time identified a potential duplication of efforts, and so they offered the incorporation society to the mayor's group. In December 2000, the MHCHS Community Action Plan, the product of Medicine Hat's first community consultation on homelessness, was approved by City Council. At that time, Medicine Hat City Council also named the Medicine Hat Community Housing Society as the community-based organization and community entity that was responsible for administering federal and provincial homelessness funds in our community. So that gives you a little bit about the history of how Medicine Hat Community Housing Society came to be known as a community-based organization and or community entity in our community. So in 2006, the Affordable Housing Task Force was presented, as well as the findings from the Standing Policy Committee, my apologies, on health and community living. The interesting thing with the Affordable Housing Task Force is that those on the task force were giving 45 days, that's it, to propose cost-effective solutions to the problem of those working families losing their home, and it had to be applicable to across all those 7 cities. So in that 45 days, that task force was exceptionally driven. They actually got the work done, and that resulted in 2 key things. It resulted in an investment of $285 million from the provincial government into affordable housing. And the second thing it did, and this was more specific to the Standing Policy Committee, was that it allowed for the investment of $16 million over 2 years to the 7 cities on housing and homelessness. And it had to focus on creative ways to actually end homelessness throughout our respective communities. When that $16 million was invested by the provincial government, there was 2 things that needed to be done. First was we need to actually come up with strategies in our respective communities. So very locally based, very grassroots, I would say. It was probably one of the best grassroots movements I've seen in a very long time. Of that $16 million invested, we committed to 7 cities, we committed to investing $1 million into provincial evaluation, and the other remaining 15 million was divided into 3. So 5 million went to Calgary, $5 million went to Edmonton, and the remaining 5 were split amongst the remaining 5 communities that make up the 7 cities. In 2008, the government of Alberta announced that it had established the Alberta Secretary for Action on Homelessness, with a mandate to develop a 10-year strategic provincial plan outlining a comprehensive, coordinated, and sustainable approach to ending homelessness. The plan was to include goals, timelines, and financial requirements, and was developed in partnership with Alberta's 7 major cities, which you know about, and they're on your screen as well. So this was also groundbreaking. At this time, this was the very first provincial plan to end homelessness in Canada. The plan was developed and published in October 2008 and outlined that the province and communities needed to fundamentally change the way homelessness was being addressed in their respective communities. This is where we hear a shift from maintaining homelessness to effectively ending homelessness and what it would take to actually do that. So instead of money being implemented and funded into more shelter spaces, the money would go to look at innovative projects that would help people get housed and support them in their housing on an ongoing basis. So spending would get focused on getting homeless Albertans into permanent housing and connecting them with the supports needed to maintain that housing. This is also the evolution of Housing First throughout not just Alberta, but throughout Canada as well. The foundation of this new approach is to ensure that the underlying factors that originally contributed to someone getting into a state of homelessness need to be addressed. Otherwise, the risk of falling back into homelessness would be very high. The plan was based on certain principles, and it was based on these 7 principles. Everyone has access to safe, affordable, and permanent housing. Addressing the root causes of homelessness is essential to ending homelessness. Preventing and ending homelessness is a shared responsibility of all orders of government, the community, the corporate sector, service providers, and citizens in general. The 4th one is programs and services are evidence-informed in their planning and demonstrate measurable outcomes at both the service provider level, service participant level, and the community level as well. 5, that the current essential services and supports are maintained during transition to permanent housing. What this means, and this was really critical, is that as we're starting new programs and services, we could not just stop doing what we were doing because there would be a huge gap in transitionary services as well. 6, the goals and initiatives are client-centered and, you heard this a lot, community-driven. And 7, the funding is long-term, predictable, and aligned with a community plan to end homelessness. This really outlined the need to do community-based planning and have a plan in place that was measurable, attainable, and that the community could actually achieve with sustainable funding. A lot of historically, the funding agreements have been on a yearly basis, which makes it very difficult to plan future programs, future systems, if we don't know if that's going to be a renewal of funding going forward. The government of Alberta outlined in this plan that the total investment over the 10 years that would be required is $3.3 billion. And that included capital costs to build housing units and operating costs to support those units as well, whether it's for individuals that were low income or those experiencing homelessness. So efforts have been made and are continuing to be made to work towards ending homelessness in the province, with the 7 cities leading the way. So recognizing that homelessness will never be solved if there is not a range of housing options and affordable options at that, the government of Alberta continued to work on making housing affordable throughout Alberta. In 2001, the government of Alberta and the government of Canada signed the Investment in Affordable Housing Agreement, the IAH, a commitment from both governments and the investment of $323 million over 8 years to help more individuals, seniors, and families access affordable housing. And this came in the form of grants available throughout public procurement processes. In 2013, the government of Alberta revisioned the Alberta Secretariat for Action on Homelessness and actually created what was called the Alberta Interagency Council on Homelessness. And the reason why this shift happened was because there was a realization at the time that you can put a lot of money into capital or a lot of money into programs and support services. However, if they were not connected in some way, you had a disconnected system that was not integrated. So the Alberta Interagency Council on Homelessness intent was to actually do that integration and support services through different ministries as well, not just the bricks and mortar of housing, but the actual systems work of that. 2017 also marked the release of the Government of Alberta's Provincial Affordable Housing Strategy to ensure the development and availability of affordable housing for those experiencing homelessness or those with lower income. In March 2019, the Alberta Social Housing Corporation, on behalf of the Government of Alberta and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, signed the CMHC bilateral agreement, which will provide the province with funding under the National Housing Strategy from April 1st, 2018 to March 31st of 2028. As part of the terms of a bilateral agreement, and bilateral agreements, for those of you that don't know, are fairly normal when we look at transfer payments from federal to provincial governments. So Alberta had to develop a 3-year action plan to guide housing initiatives in the province and describe proposed programs and funding allocations under a cost-matched program. The actions and outcomes described in those plans are associated with housing initiatives. Alberta will use the funds under the National Housing Strategy to maintain, improve, renew, and expand affordable housing, as well as support the priorities related to it. The first 3-year action plan was released. It's called Alberta's Action Plan for the National Housing Strategy 2019 to 2022. So that is a lot of information to take in. I unfortunately cannot see people on my screen. It's a lot of information. What I want you to take away from those elements is, one, the rise and fall of social housing and investment in that from a federal level, and how those policies created poverty and in lots of cases homelessness throughout Alberta and the rest of the country. That there has not been a national housing strategy up until very recently. Another thing I want you to hopefully will take away from that is with the government of Alberta and the obvious shift towards ending homelessness and not just maintaining homelessness. And that is through progressive work. Keep in mind, this was a grassroots movement, and it really did focus first and foremost around working families. Like we see a lot of our systems is about working families or the working poor, if you will. So what we have today in terms of our homeless initiatives are very differently focused, where we look at people that are in a state of chronic homelessness. Now, here's the thing. You can't get into a state of chronic homelessness unless you've been in that state for a very long time. So 6 months, again, over the course of a year, or 18 months over the last 3 years. So We're talking about individuals where these systems have, and lots of different types of system have maybe not stepped in or up or have fallen a little bit short of what people are actually needing and experiencing. And the absence of affordable housing means you cannot effectively address homelessness in any community. And you may even be perpetuating that in every community. The absence of housing means you can't effectively house people. So outside of Alberta and Canada, I do have to put a plug in here for Orcode Consulting, who is a leader in homelessness initiatives and actively work with not-for-profits, governments, private companies as well, and non-government organizations across the world to effectively look at strategies, policies, and really day-to-day operations about what it means to end homelessness. They do professional development and coaching for those who work in the sector, planning, and policy research and evaluation, of course, and a lot of educating and provoking. And with that leadership development about getting communities to really engage and look at homelessness differently from a policy to practice perspective and everything in between. Medicine Hat's development and our evolution of our system of care has been guided by the work of Orco Consulting since the onset of our plan. Little known tidbit for people. So we'll go to more locally in Medicine Hat. So for those of you that were able to participate in our very first community engagement and presentation, you'll know the role of the community-based organization and community entity. So in Medicine Hat, we are the community-based organization and community entity. We are one of the first Canadian cities to commit to ending homelessness back in 2009, and that's along with our 7 cities colleagues as well. When we took the approach in 2009, it was based on, and it still is based on, a housing first approach and philosophy, meaning everyone has a right to housing. Since then, there have been some major steps forward for Medicine Hat. And that's really driving us to do better, work at systems improvement, and look at how we can share our good work and our lessons learned. So not just the great stuff, but the stuff where we faltered and maybe tripped along the way as well, and had some really great lessons and insurings that we could provide people. So we really like to encourage people to reach out and ask those questions as well, not just the great stuff that we've accomplished, but kind of those stumbling blocks along the way as well. In Starting at Home in Medicine Hat our 5-year plan to end homelessness, which was actually released and held us from 2010 to 2015. The community laid out its vision, key principles, and core strategies to actually realize this vision. An update of the plan was made in 2014 with the goal of ending homelessness in Medicine Hat by 2015. And since that time, the system of care in Medicine Hat, with the Homeless and Housing Development Department leading that, has continued to work towards an end to homelessness in the community, using data-driven, evidence-based, housing first, client-centered. We get all those keywords in there as well, and cannot say enough about our community partners along the way, and those individuals that we are here to serve that actually do the hard work of getting housed, of maintaining to their case plan, getting back up when they have stumbled perhaps, and that they are really driven and committed to getting themselves housed. And to improve their lives, whatever that looks like for them. In terms of our service providers, we went over them quite extensively at the last community engagement session that we have. Please look to our website. They are all listed on there as well. And you can learn a lot about the programs and services that they offer. Their job is a tough job. They support individuals and also work with community and landlords to navigate through some of these systems of care. So what? We always like the so what. So we have all these different individuals, organizations, and governments actively working towards end homelessness across Canada. But what does an end to homelessness actually look like? We know that we will never get to a point that we won't have a single person experiencing homelessness in community. There will always be an emergency, a breakdown in family, a flood perhaps. There will always be situations that will unfortunately drive people out of their homes. And we don't have control over that. But what we do have control over, and what our role is to ensure that we have effective systems to effectively respond and get those individuals out of that state of homelessness and stabilized as soon as possible. We don't want individuals to become entrenched in a homeless lifestyle. Our goal is to make sure they have access to the supports to keep them house route. Recognizing that this is what an end to homelessness most likely will look like, we can see how the federal and provincial governments' definitions compared to Medicine Hat's definitions are a little bit different. And we're going to go through some of that as well. And this is the important thing. There is no national plan to end homelessness. And people are quite surprised at that. There is no national plan to end homelessness. So it can get confusing. So the Canadian definition of ending homelessness was actually developed by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and Built for Zero Canada. And these were borrowed from our colleagues in the States for Built for Zero US, obviously. So they focus on certain populations within those experiencing homelessness. And that is the approach adopted by the CAH and the Built for Zero team. And specifically, it's focusing on individuals experiencing chronic homelessness or those veterans that are experiencing homeless, regardless of their duration or frequency of homelessness. So for those of you that maybe have not participated in anything else with our learning sessions, individuals experiencing chronic homelessness are they have spent 6 months or more homeless over the past year, or individuals have spent 18 months homeless over the last 3 years. And a veteran, by definition, is someone who has served in the Canadian Armed Forces. However, this is being looked at given that we have a lot of other individuals that may be now residents that maybe didn't serve specifically in the Canadian Armed Forces that are experiencing homelessness in any community. So by adopting a baseline of how many people can experience chronic homelessness within a community without overwhelming and without overtaxing our system, it means effectively that we've ended homelessness. There's a lot of discussion around language and the importance of language. I'm a fan of the importance of language and why we do that, and just a little bit of insight for folks of why do we choose to say end homelessness. Because we kind of want to reduce doesn't sound great. Because when we look at something a little bit more significant and severe like suicide rates, I would hope that as a community, we would strive to end suicide in our community by having the appropriate resources and supports available. I would hope that we would actually drive towards ending that experience for someone, whether it's homelessness or mental health or addictions. So ending something is a very bold statement. It's very intentional. And it's around that commitment to always doing better and always ensuring that those appropriate supports and services are available for people. As much as we try to communicate, ending homelessness means we have a great system of care in place. We're always going to get some keyboard warriors who seem to be very persistent around what that means to actually end homelessness. So thank you for getting educated today. That is most helpful. In Medicine Hat, when we talk about functionally ending chronic homelessness, is what it has been termed by our federal partners. It's 3 or fewer people that are chronically homeless in our community, and that we have 3 or fewer people over the course of 3 months. So I think in July, we have bumped up to 4 individuals, which means we are essentially out of functional zero right now. And that's okay. We have 6 months to go back. Keep in mind, it's a system of care. It is a dynamic system. So that can be someone that was experiencing chronic homelessness, moved into our community. That bumps us up. So it's a fluid system. All this information is publicly available on the Built for Zero website, which is, if you just Google it, it is there. So ending homelessness in Alberta, and what that means is that first recognizing that there will always be a need for emergency shelters. This was something we learned along the way. Shelters at the time thought, if you're investing in housing first and getting people housed, that means no emergency shelters. No, we will always need emergency shelters within our community, emergency shelters for youth, emergency shelters for individuals fleeing violence or family violence, and individuals that just hit that state of homelessness, whether it's brief or one time, or if they even cycle back within the system. We will always need emergency shelters in our community. The goal throughout Alberta is that those that do enter into that state of homelessness are quickly rehoused into permanent housing within 21 days. And that's the goal. That's the goal with women's shelter. It's the goal with adult shelters as well. The youth, we like to see them go home a lot sooner than that. And I know that they are doing a phenomenal work in lots of different areas there. So the 5 priority areas for action throughout Alberta, and that plan to end homelessness in Alberta is based on these 5 things: better information, always better information, collecting, researching, and sharing essential information that focuses on outcomes. We do a lot of information sharing as appropriate and with client consent. Really important that agencies and service providers share the right level of information to actually house and support people. Aggressive assistance. Make sure Albertans have the resources they need to secure and keep stable homes. This is one where I think we could do a lot better work across the province. Coordinated systems, ensuring governments, agencies, and communities work together in an integrative, efficient way towards shared objectives. This is where we talk about systems integration as well, and not just at the local level. This needs to happen at a provincial and federal level as well. When we have a disconnection of services and supports, sometimes that's about, most times it's about those systems not operating in tandem and for the best interest of the client, because there's different objectives attached to each of those, I'm going to say, social serving agencies or government agencies, if you will. We do need more housing options. Increasing not just the quantity, but the variety of housing options is really important. We are fortunate to have permanent supportive housing in our community, which took until 2017 to actually get that in place, which was a long time given the needs of those in our community. And the last one, of course, is effective policies. And implementing government policies that bring down all those barriers to rehousing individuals and promote the goal of ending homelessness. Next week, when we talk about our myth busters, we're going to be talking about some of these policies in the not for policy's sake, but to show people where the barriers actually exist in housing people sometimes. So of course, ending homelessness in Medicine Hat. Back in 2015, this was our definition of that. That no one in the community would have to live in emergency shelter or sleep rough for more than 10 days before they had access to housing and supports to keep them housed. This is an old definition. It's something that still holds true. So this is when we announced in 2015 that we had ended homelessness. It was based on this definition. What we announced at the start of June was based on the federal definition from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and the Built for Zero crew. And that was around chronic homelessness and the timelines associated with that with functional zero. In Medicine Hat, we actually have 5 different areas that we focus on. This is also available on our website, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Of course, we talk about systems planning, housing and supports, system integration, and prevention. Great way to stop the inflow of homelessness is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So this is where programs like housing loss prevention come into play. It's far easier on the family or the individual to keep them housed and supported if it is safe in that environment to keep them there where they're currently housed. Data and research, of course, we're heavy on the data and the research component, and leadership in sustainability, including increasing public awareness and engagement, which is why you're all here today. So thank you for that. So this is an odd question. When should we end homelessness? And what does that look like? So on the national level in Canada, it's actually to reduce chronic and veteran homelessness by 50% in the respective communities and jurisdictions by 2027, 2028. So this is the important thing of data across Canada is we're actually measured on a community by community basis. So anyone that has a either designated community, a territorial one, or an Indigenous agreement around homelessness and rural and remote as well, you have to reduce chronic homelessness by 2027, 2028. That is a requirement of your grant funding agreement. In Alberta, initially it was to end homelessness by 2019. However, we continue to work towards ending homelessness throughout Alberta. Interesting enough, Alberta does not have a new plan to end homelessness. So 7 cities and other partners are working to really encourage the provincial government to look at renewing the strategy to end homelessness and to really having a coordinated approach and effort around that. The work is still happening, but that not from a provincial level in that type of coordinated way where we had the Alberta Secretariat in place and then the Alberta Interagency Council on Homelessness, which actually went away when new government came into play. In Medicine Hat, of course, we hit the 2015, we hit the 2021, and our goal is to continue to increase and improve our systems. We still have a lot of work to do, folks, and we're not blind to that. And part of that is being okay with and being responsive to what our community is saying, what the data is telling us as well. We know that we are struggling right now to find affordable housing. We will have an increase of people experiencing homelessness in our community. That is a fact. And it's because we have the CERB payments that are running out for folks as well. We have over the last year seen a lot of people that have never experienced homelessness lose their housing. They have had to come and use our services and our systems. So it's not just maybe who you see utilizing the shelter. We actually have people that are currently sleeping in vehicles right now that do access supports and services through many different programs. And then we do have individuals that are couch surfing with friends or whatever that looks like. When we look at the effect of the pandemic, this is just more exasperated by the pandemic. This was always there. So I need to be really clear about that. So it's not that we do know where people are and where they're sleeping, or those in parking lots that are, waiting for their next check to come in. So if you do encounter individuals, please have them come in. There are resources available through not just us, but through other great programs and services throughout Medicine Hat that can help them get into stable housing and then help support them to keep them in their housing as well. Where we had to continue this with the where. So where do you want to end homelessness, folks? Pretty self-explanatory, but we didn't want to break the ranks of the who, what, where, when, and why of homelessness. So federal government is committed to ending homelessness and improving housing options for all Canadians. In Alberta, it's the Ending Homelessness in Alberta. It is around ensuring that there's access to provincial supports, even looking at rates of AISH benefit and other types of benefit. Little known fact for folks, for a single individual that is maybe receiving a social benefit payment, their core shelter is $330. Let me know if you can find housing and support yourself on $330 a month. So this is where these other programs and services are so critical, because what we will do is actually do a rent top up for those individuals. I can't find housing for $330 and sustain myself. So that's when we talk about the policy alignment and whatnot. So again, more on that next week, but that will give you some insight into just one of those things that we look at in Medicine Hat, just end homelessness in Medicine Hat, of course. So why? Why do we actually want to do this work? And why is this work important for us to do? We can get into the Seneca of the why we do the work and make it really personal, but I'm going to keep it high level right now. Really, housing is a fundamental human right. It's better investment of funds to house and support individuals versus maintain that state of homelessness. So if you reflect back onto the first couple slides, when the federal and the provincial governments looked at their national housing initiative at the time, or national homelessness initiative at the time, and then the provincial money that came in. At the time, I was up in Grand Prairie doing the work, and let me tell you how good I was at maintaining homelessness. We bought a lot of tents, we bought a lot of working boots for people, but not to work, to sleep outside in, because they were heavier. We bought a lot of food as well. In my first year or so there, we didn't house a single person, because that is not what you did at the time. It was comfort for people. You made people comfortable in their state of homelessness. When we first stumbled upon S7 Cities, Housing First, and what that looked like, I did a pilot project of one person. So for those of you that are into data and research, you do not do a pilot project of one person. But we did a pilot project of one person and really learned as we went through that it actually works. It works, and it was about choice. And then from there, it just kind of took off, and it was the traction that was around it, and it was really the right thing to do. So housing as a fundamental human right. So housing is recognized as a fundamental human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights developed by the United Nations. It's Article 25, Section 1 outlines that, and I'm going to quote it here, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So it also forms part of several of the UN sustainable development goals, pardon me, including 1, no poverty, 2, zero hunger, 3, good health and well-being, and goal number 10, reduced inequalities. So Canada has also recognized that adequate housing is a fundamental human right by ratifying the International Covenant on Economics, Social, and Cultural Rights, and has agreed to take appropriate steps, realizing the rights set out within the covenant. So there are some big things going on at the federal level, and that's essentially taking a rights-based approach to housing. People have a right to adequate and sustainable housing and supports to keep them there. So regardless of how people got into a state of homelessness, regardless of what they are currently doing in their lives or not doing in their lives, it's a belief that everyone does have a right to housing. And really, essentially is a fundamental human right. The lack of housing and stability within house and that security prevents a lot of people from furthering their own individual goals and their own desires as well. Housing is where one starts from, not usually where one ends up as the last starting point. So the second point of that, other than it's a fundamental human right, is it's really a better investment of money. It saves money, folks. Most of the costs for those experiencing homelessness is actually from public system utilization, and we track this extensively. For those that may not know, within our system of care, individuals are assessed every 3 months about their system utilization, every individual. So whether they're in the program 3 months or 12 years, 3-month intervals, they are assessed so that we can have this information. So the annual cost of homelessness on public systems is between $66,000 and $120,000 per individual. Now we're talking days in hospital, police response sometimes. If they're sleeping outside, police having to respond to that. EMS calls. It is tough to be homeless, especially if you are sleeping outside. It is tough, and it costs those systems a lot of money to respond to people that are outside or maybe just not adequately served right now. The cost in medical alone, when we have individuals that go into housing, we actually see an increase in hospitalizations and with interactions with doctors. And the reason why is because left untreated for years and years and years, you're bound to have issues come up in your health and well-being, and whether that's a physical ailment or mental health and wellness that hasn't been checked over time perhaps, or maybe it has been for those that are fortunate enough to be already connected. So we see the cost decrease significantly between $12,000 and $34,000 for after those individuals are actually housed and supported adequately. That's not to say that we don't have some individuals that are needing a lot of different types of services. So this is on average. We have some individuals that will require a high degree and level of care, and they will always require that level of care and will always have, I'm not going to say high, they're going to be high interactions with systems, but they're appropriate interactions with systems. And that is the difference. It's the inappropriate versus appropriate use of systems in their interactions with their. So essentially, a healthy community is a prosperous community. When we look at days in hospital for the 995 individuals that we have housed and served through our program, so that gives you a 2009 to 2021 date, we see a 32% reduction for the number of days in jail. If you want to math it out, average day in jail is between $1,200 and $1,500. And it's not just, and this is going to be relative to actually the how many numbers, which is on the left-hand side, so just close to 10,000 days down to about 6,000 days. EMS interactions are actually up, and then days in jail down 67%, which is staggering. We also see court appearances go up 35% overall. When this first came out, we were quite concerned that, why is court appearances going up? And it was interesting hearing from the Crown Prosecutor's office. It was because people were showing up to court if they had outstanding issues. Even if they didn't have any outstanding issues, they were showing up to court as well just to see if they had any outstanding issues. So having individuals put strain on public systems, housing them and supporting them is definitely the most cost-effective way to go. So while thinking about how ending homelessness saves money compared to maintaining it, so we could have spent a lot of money on sandwiches and tents. We have to think about the community and the impact on the community as well. A healthy community is a prosperous community. In other words, a community where basic needs of all individuals are met: shelter, food, water, and clothing. It's a community where individuals have the freedom and opportunity to actively engage with businesses, organizations, cultural groups, religious groups, and more within the community. So finally, ending homelessness is simply good for business and politics, folks. Something that we don't usually say. It is good for business. Customers and constituents that have ails about people sleeping or standing outside, businesses that will, don't want people to do that because supports and services are in place for anyone in need of housing. We have to create effective and robust systems that people will actively engage in so that there isn't that active presence, I'm going to say. And it's not that people need to hide or be, out of the limelight a little bit, if they are out of the public eye, I should say, if they are experiencing homelessness. But we need to make darn sure that we have those services in place that individuals want to engage with. Most of the time, when people don't agree with our reason about why we want to house and support individuals, they typically agree with the second reason. So even if people say that, housing is not a fundamental human right, or that, I can get a job, why can't other people get a job? Or I was there, I got myself out, or maybe if they quit using drugs or not being lean, not engaging in certain behaviors, don't necessarily disagree with that, but then we also meet people where they are at, not where that person is at, that is making those comments as well. And that is a tough transition for some folks. And it's not that they are wrong, there's just more options than that approach to take as well. So, and we recognize that it's about choice. And if someone is not engaging in supports and services, we need to take a hard look and a hard line look at what we are doing as a community and what type of services are being offered, and actually have the conversation with individuals that are experiencing homelessness and go, why are you not engaging, or what can we offer that you would actually like to engage with so we can adequately house you and support you so that you can fulfill whatever goals you have. And it's really taking that approach that is really important. At the end of the day, there is one taxpayer, and we prefer to actually house and support individuals than help them maintain themselves in that state of homelessness.